when the human soul touches awakening, when the unconscious rises into the light of consciousness, something strange and often unsettling happens. The very things that once filled you with joy no longer call to you in the same way. The hobbies, the passions, the diversions that once defined your identity begin to feel shallow, even meaningless. Carl Jung understood this transformation deeply. He saw that when a person awakens to their inner world, the psyche demands a new path, one that is no longer satisfied by surface pleasures, but seeks alignment with a deeper truth. This shift is not loss. It is the natural reorientation of your energy toward what is essential, what is eternal, what is authentically you. To lose interest in what once entertained you is not a sign of emptiness, but of growth, of soul expansion, and of the profound journey into individuation, where your life becomes guided by meaning rather than distraction. When Carl Jung spoke of awakening, he was not referring to a fleeting moment of inspiration or a simple change of mind. He was describing a profound psychological event where the psyche begins to reorganize itself around deeper truths. Awakening, in the Jungian sense, is the stirring of the unconscious, the emergence of archetypes, the confrontation with symbols that speak not to the surface of our lives, but to the depths of our being. And in this transformation, one of the most common and bewildering experiences is the sudden loss of interest in things that once defined us. Our hobbies, our passions, our favorite activities, what once brought us excitement now feels strangely empty. And this leaves many wondering, what is wrong with me? But Jung would remind us nothing is wrong. Something is changing. Something essential is reorienting the currents of psychic energy. To understand this loss of interest, we must first understand what hobbies, activities, and passions represent in the psyche before awakening. Before one confronts the unconscious, the ego is in charge. The ego seeks identity. It seeks security. It seeks pleasure. Hobbies become vehicles through which we stabilize ourselves, through which we express fragments of our personality, through which we distract ourselves from inner conflicts that have not yet been made conscious. A person may pour their evenings into painting, music, sports, or collecting because these activities offer meaning at a surface level, a place where energy can flow without questioning the deeper foundations of life. In Jung's language, these hobbies are often ways of satisfying the persona, the mask we wear for ourselves and for others. They keep the ego comfortable, entertained, and stable in its little world. But when awakening occurs, the structure of the psyche begins to change. Energy that once flowed outward begins to turn inward. Jung observed this in countless patients as they moved toward individuation. The libido, the psychological energy that fuels desires and activities, no longer invested itself in the same external outlets. The painting no longer excites. The guitar feels quiet in the corner. The football field loses its thrill. Instead, energy is being drawn into the inner world. Symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and new questions about meaning begin to absorb the psyche's attention. The individual feels less pulled toward doing and more compelled toward being. This shift is not depression in the pathological sense, though many mistake it for that. It is the redirection of psychic energy from surface level pursuits to the profound work of self-discovery. Why does this redirection feel so unsettling? Because the ego, which has built its sense of identity on these activities, feels abandoned. If I am not the painter, who am I? If I am not the passionate traveler, who am I? If I am not the one who loves books, films, or fashion, then what remains? Jung would argue that what remains is the self, the deeper, larger center of the psyche that is now calling for attention. The ego resists this shift because it thrives on the familiar. Losing interest in hobbies is not just about losing activities, it is about losing ego, identities that have been tied to them. The awakening individual is stripped of these labels so that something more authentic can emerge. This is why Jung spoke of the death of the ego. Not death in the sense of annihilation, but in the sense of surrender. The hobbies that once reinforced ego identity dissolve in importance so that the deeper self can begin to reorganize life. At first, this feels like emptiness. The person may look at their shelves of books, their instruments, their paints, their video games, and feel nothing. Where there was once joy, there is now silence. This silence is the threshold of transformation. It is the psyche gathering its energy for a new direction. In Jungian psychology, this shift can be explained by the principle of compensation. The unconscious balances what the conscious mind has neglected. If the conscious ego has poured itself too much into external pleasures and ignored inner work, then awakening pulls energy inward to restore balance. Suddenly, the unconscious demands attention. Dreams become more vivid. Intuition becomes louder. Inner conflicts rise to the surface, and the hobbies that once masked or distracted from these inner demands lose their appeal. The psyche says, no more distractions. The time has come to listen. This is not to say that hobbies are meaningless after awakening. Rather, they are transformed. They are stripped of their unconscious function as ego, support, and must be reborn as conscious expressions of the self. A person may find, after a time, that they return to painting, not to impress or distract themselves, but to express symbols from their dreams. They may play music again, not for social approval, but because the melodies emerge from the depths of their soul. They may engage in exercise, not for competition or vanity, but as a way of harmonizing body and spirit. The hobbies are not lost forever. They are transfigured. But before that transfiguration, they must go through death. Jung's work often emphasized this cycle, death and rebirth. The death of interest in hobbies is one manifestation of the death of old forms. The rebirth, however, depends on one's willingness to embrace the emptiness without rushing to fill it. This is the danger of the awakening period. The ego, feeling threatened, may desperately seek new distractions, new hobbies, new pleasures, new addictions, to avoid facing the silence. But Jung would caution, stay with the silence, let the emptiness speak. Only then can the new, authentic forms of joy emerge. Another layer of this transformation lies in the archetypal dimension. Many hobbies and activities before awakening are tied to collective archetypes. The hero, the lover, the creator, the explorer. We take up activities that allow us to embody these archetypes without necessarily confronting them consciously. But awakening brings the archetypes closer to consciousness. instead of merely playing at being the hero through a hobby. The individual may be forced to confront the heroic journey in their own life, instead of merely dabbling in the creative archetype through casual art. The individual may feel compelled to bring forth genuine symbols from the unconscious. The archetypes demand more than play, they demand transformation. The old hobbies can feel trivial because the archetypal energy behind them is calling for a deeper engagement. Jung described this process as the movement from the outer to the inner world, from the personal to the transpersonal, from the ego to the self. In this movement, old sources of energy dry up. What once thrilled now feels empty. The psyche is no longer satisfied with surface pleasures because it has tasted the deeper waters. Once a person begins to sense the presence of the self, the small entertainments of the ego pale in comparison. It is like a person who has seen the vast ocean. The small pond in their backyard cannot hold their interest anymore. Of course, this process is not without suffering. Many who awaken feel lost, disconnected, alienated from their old life. They may even feel guilt or shame for abandoning hobbies they once loved. Friends may not understand. Family may worry. But Jung would say, trust the process. This loss is part of the individuation journey, the great path toward wholeness. The hobbies are not gone forever. They are being purified. In practical terms, this means allowing yourself to rest in the in-between. When you no longer feel joy in your old hobbies, do not force yourself back into them. Instead, observe, journal your dreams. Pay attention to synchronicities. Allow your psyche to guide you into what is next. The new direction may not look like the old hobbies at all. It may be something entirely new, something that aligns with your deeper self rather than your old persona. Or it may be a return to the old, but in a transformed way. The key is patience and trust. Carl Jung often reminded us that the psyche has its own wisdom far beyond the grasp of the ego. Losing interest in hobbies is one way this wisdom manifests. It clears the ground. It empties the vessel. It prepares the soul for something larger. To resist this process is to cling to the past. To accept it is to step into the flow of individuation. When you awaken and find yourself uninterested in what once thrilled you, remember Jung's insight. This is not failure, not laziness, not depression. It is the natural withdrawal of psychic energy from the trivial, so it can be invested in the essential. Your soul is calling you home. Carl Jung's central concept of individuation lies at the heart of understanding why, after awakening, the activities and hobbies that once brought satisfaction often fade into the background. Individuation is not merely self-improvement, nor is it the acquisition of new skills or achievements. It is the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating the unconscious and conscious aspects of the psyche, of moving from living as a fragment of yourself toward embodying the fullness of who you truly are. When this inner core begins to stir, the ordinary amusements that once kept you engaged can no longer hold your energy in the same way. They lose their grip, not because they are inherently bad, but because the psyche has recognized that they no longer serve the deeper journey it has now committed itself to. Before awakening, hobbies and surface level pleasures often operate as substitutes for meaning. They give us a sense of identity, purpose, and fulfillment in a world where deeper truths remain hidden in the unconscious. A person might find their identity in being the writer, the gamer, the athlete, or the musician, or the traveler. These identities provide stability, a sense of belonging, and temporary satisfaction. Jung did not dismiss these things. They can be healthy outlets for creativity and energy. But he warned that if we cling to them as our only source of identity, they can prevent us from hearing the deeper call of the soul. Individuation begins when those surface identities are stripped away, not out of cruelty, but to make space for the authentic self to emerge. When individuation begins, the psyche pulls energy away from the persona, the social mask that we wear to fit in and to gain recognition. Hobbies often serve the persona more than they serve the soul. They become ways of being seen in a certain light, ways of projecting an image outward that others can accept and admire. But the individuation process cares little for the applause of the outer world. It is a turning inward, a movement toward the hidden depths where the self resides. The old hobbies, once infused with unconscious energy, are now drained because the libido, the vital force of the psyche, is being redirected toward a new task. The integration of the shadow, the confrontation with archetypes, the search for meaning beyond social identity. This redirection can feel deeply unsettling. Many people in the early stages of awakening describe it as boredom, emptiness, or even despair. The activities they once relied on to bring joy suddenly feel flat. They may attempt to force themselves back into those hobbies, only to find that the spark is gone. Jung would say this is not a sign of decline, but of transition. The old containers are too small for the energy that now seeks a larger vessel. What once fit comfortably within the ego's framework can no longer hold the expansiveness of the self. The boredom is not emptiness. It is the psyche saying, there is more for you now. Do not cling to the old ways. Individuation requires courage because it demands the sacrifice of comfort. When hobbies lose their appeal, the ego panics. It asks, who am I without these things? Jung observed this crisis in many patients who began the work of depth psychology. Their lives, once filled with external activities, suddenly seemed stripped bare. They often mistook this state for depression. Yet Jung recognized it as the soul's demand for authenticity. The hobbies were never the true source of meaning. They were placeholders. Once the self makes its presence known, the soul refuses substitutes. This refusal may feel like loss, but it is in fact liberation. The freeing of energy from the trivial, so it can be invested in the essential. Another aspect of individuation is the integration of the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we deny, repress, or project onto others. Before awakening, hobbies often serve as distractions from this work. They keep us busy, entertained, occupied, so that we do not have to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But when awakening begins, the unconscious rises, demanding that these truths be confronted. The loss of interest in hobbies is therefore not simply about boredom, but about the psyche refusing distraction. Instead of running to a hobby to escape inner conflict, the individual is now compelled to turn inward and meet their shadow face to face. The time once spent on hobbies may now be spent journaling dreams, exploring inner symbols, or wrestling with deep questions about existence. This process is rarely comfortable, but Jung emphasized that it is necessary. The old self must dissolve for the new self to be born, just as the caterpillar must abandon crawling before it can transform into a butterfly. The awakening individual must abandon reliance on old amusements to become whole. The withdrawal from hobbies is therefore symbolic of a deeper withdrawal, a turning away from the false self toward the authentic self. Importantly, Jung recognized that individuation is not isolation from the world. It is not about rejecting life or withdrawing permanently from all activities. Rather, it is about transforming the way we relate to the world. After a period of emptiness, many find that they return to their old hobbies, but with a different energy. The painter paints again, but now the paintings express archetypal symbols from dreams. The musician returns to their instrument, but the music becomes a channel for the soul rather than a performance for others. The traveler still journeys, but now the journey is inward as much as outward. In individuation, hobbies are reborn as conscious expressions of the self rather than unconscious outlets for the ego. Why, then, do so many mistake this phase for depression or decline? Because our culture equates activity with vitality. We are told that to stop doing is to stop living, that to lose interest is a sign of sickness. But Jung turned this idea upside down. He saw that the withdrawal of energy from external activities is often the very sign of an inner renewal. The psyche is preparing for transformation. Just as winter appears barren before spring, the soul appears empty before rebirth. The loss of hobbies is winter. It is the season of withdrawal, stillness, preparation. What follows is the spring of individuation, where authentic creativity and meaning blossom. Jung's own life mirrored this process. He himself went through a period after his break with Freud when he felt empty and disconnected from his old interests. He described how he withdrew into solitude, listened to his dreams, painted mandalas, and allowed symbols from the unconscious to emerge. This was not a time of external hobbies. It was a time of inner work. And from this inner work came his greatest contributions to psychology. The concepts of archetypes, individuation, synchronicity, and the collective unconscious. Jung's experience shows us that when hobbies lose their appeal, it may be the threshold of profound creativity and insight. It is also important to note that individuation is not a straight path. The loss of hobbies may come in waves. A person may abandon certain activities only to return to them later with new purpose, or they may discover entirely new outlets that align with their soul. The key is not to cling to the old or to force the new, but to trust the process. The psyche knows what it is doing, even when the ego feels lost. This trust is difficult because individuation often feels like losing oneself. Without the old hobbies and identities, life can feel groundless. But Jung would reassure us that what is being lost is not the self, but the false self. The real self is emerging, and it needs space. The emptiness is that space being cleared. The silence is the soil being prepared. The apparent loss is the condition for gain. So, when you lose interest in hobbies after awakening, remember Jung's wisdom. This is the call of individuation. It is the soul pulling you away from surface level pleasures so that you can walk the deeper path toward wholeness. The ego may resist, it may mourn, but the self is patient. It knows that in time, the individual will discover a joy that no hobby alone could ever provide. A joy rooted in authenticity, in meaning, in union with the depths of the psyche. When the psyche begins its awakening, there is a transformation not only of thought but of desire itself. Carl Jung understood that the libido, the life energy that fuels all human motivation, is not fixed on one object, but fluid, constantly seeking expression. Before awakening, desire often attaches itself to hobbies, amusements, and diversions that keep the ego occupied. We feel passion for playing music, excitement for reading novels, thrill in sports, or joy in social activities. These things are not meaningless, but they are often ways in which the libido finds temporary outlets, while the deeper currents of the psyche remain hidden. When awakening occurs, this energy begins to shift its direction. The result is not that we become lifeless, but that we feel a strange withdrawal from what once satisfied us, as if desire itself has changed its nature. Jung saw this as a redirection of libido from the outer world to the inner world. What once drove us outward toward hobbies and activities now begins to drive us inward toward reflection, meaning, and transformation. The unconscious, which has long held archetypes and symbols in silence, begins to speak. The ego, once entertained by external pleasures, no longer finds them fulfilling because the energy of desire has been seized by something deeper. This is why losing interest in hobbies after awakening is not a failure, but a sign of growth. Desire is no longer satisfied by distraction. It now seeks purpose. This transformation of desire can be disorienting. Many who awaken feel restless, unable to engage with old activities, but not yet sure what new direction to pursue. Jung would explain that this restlessness is the psyche adjusting to a new orientation. The libido is no longer content with trivialities. It is searching for alignment with the self. This means that what used to feel like joy now feels empty, and what used to be enough now feels insufficient. The change is not in the world outside, but in the desire within. One of the most striking features of this transformation is the way it reveals the illusions that hobbies once masked. Many people invest enormous amounts of time and passion into hobbies not only for enjoyment, but to fill an inner void. The activity distracts them from unresolved conflicts, unacknowledged fears, and unfulfilled desires. Jung called this process unconscious compensation. The hobby compensates for what is missing in the psyche. But once awakening begins, this unconscious mechanism is disrupted. The hobby can no longer serve as a bandage for the deeper wound. The psyche refuses distraction and insists on truth. As a result, desire turns away from external pursuits and toward inner integration. This transformation often creates tension between the ego and the self. The ego longs for the old pleasures. It wants the familiar feeling of satisfaction that hobbies once provided. But the self demands more. It whispers through dreams, synchronicities, and intuition, saying, "Do not waste your energy here anymore. You are meant for something greater." The ego resists, clinging to the old, but The libido obeys the call of the self. This is why forcing yourself back into hobbies often feels unsatisfying after awakening. The energy is simply no longer there. Desire has already shifted allegiance. Jung often compared this process to alchemy. In alchemy, the base material must be transformed through fire into something higher, something purer. Desire is the fire. Before awakening, it burns in many directions, igniting short-lived passions. After awakening, the fire is gathered and focused. It burns away illusions, melts down false identities, and refines the soul. The loss of interest in hobbies is like the cooling of one flame so that another, deeper flame can rise. To the ego, it feels like extinction. To the soul, it is transmutation. The transformation of desire also reshapes the meaning of creativity. Before awakening, creativity often expresses itself in hobbies without awareness of its deeper source. A person paints because they enjoy colors, writes because they enjoy words, or plays music because it soothes them. After awakening, creativity is no longer just entertainment. It becomes revelation. Jung himself experienced this when he began creating his Red Book. What began as private sketches and fantasies turned into a profound dialogue with his unconscious. The same transformation can happen to anyone. What once was a hobby becomes a vessel for symbols, archetypes, and truth rising from within. But this new creativity requires the death of the old desire, the surrender of shallow passion, so that authentic inspiration can take its place. Another key dimension of this transformation is its relation to meaning. Jung observed that modern humans suffer not from too much desire, but from too little meaning. We fill our lives with diversions, activities, and pleasures, but deep down we hunger for purpose. Awakening reveals this hunger by stripping desire of its old objects. The loss of interest in hobbies is the psyche's way of saying, this is not enough. Seek what truly matters. Desire is thus transformed from the pursuit of pleasure to the pursuit of meaning. It is no longer about what entertains, but about what nourishes the soul. This transformation can be uncomfortable because it exposes the gap between who we thought we were and who we are becoming. Many people build their identities around their hobbies. They are the athlete, the gamer, the musician, the collector. When desire withdraws from these activities, identity itself begins to dissolve. Jung would say this is necessary for individuation. We are not our hobbies, not our personas, not our masks. We are something deeper. The withdrawal of desire is the beginning of disidentification from the false self. It opens the door for the self to emerge as the true center of life. It is important to recognize that this transformation does not mean hobbies are forever abandoned. Rather, they are purified. When desire is redirected toward the self, hobbies can return as conscious choices rather than unconscious compulsions. A person may still paint, but now they paint to express symbols from their inner life. They may still play music, but now the music is an offering from their soul rather than a distraction for their mind. The hobby becomes sacred, a ritual rather than a pastime. In this sense, awakening elevates hobbies from entertainment to expression of the self. However, there is a stage between the loss of old desire and the discovery of new purpose. This stage often feels like a void. People describe it as emptiness, numbness, or lack of motivation. Jung would remind us that this void is essential. It is the space where desire is being restructured. It is the silence before the new song. It is the stillness before the new dance. The temptation in this stage is to panic and rush back into old hobbies or seek new ones to fill the gap. But Jung cautioned against this. The void must be endured. Only in the void can the transformation of desire complete itself. Jung also emphasized the role of symbols in this process. Desire, once detached from hobbies, often reappears in symbolic form through dreams, art, or imagination. The Psyche presents images that reveal where energy is now meant to flow. Paying attention to these symbols can guide the awakened individual toward new expressions of desire that align with their deeper purpose. For example, someone who loses interest in casual painting may dream of vibrant mandalas. This symbol points the way to a new form of creativity that expresses the archetypal self. In this way, the unconscious provides guidance for the rebirth of desire. This transformation of desire is also connected to the archetype of the seeker. Once awakened, the individual is no longer satisfied with shallow pleasures, but is compelled to search for truth. The hobbies that once provided comfort are abandoned because the soul has become restless for what is eternal. This archetypal energy drives the person forward, often through periods of solitude, study, or inner exploration. The desire that once attached to games and diversions now attaches to wisdom, symbols, and the mysteries of life. Ultimately, Jung would say that the transformation of desire is a movement from distraction to destiny. Before awakening, desire is scattered across hobbies that keep us entertained. After awakening, desire is gathered into the search for meaning, the pursuit of individuation, the realization of the self. This does not diminish life, it deepens it. The loss of old passions is the birth of a greater passion, the passion for wholeness. So when you lose interest in your hobbies after awakening, see it not as a sign of decline, but as a sign of transformation. Your desire is not dying, it is being reborn. The old objects of passion no longer satisfy, because your soul now seeks what only truth, meaning, and authenticity can provide. Jung would remind us the fire of desire never goes out. It only changes its direction. And after awakening, that fire is no longer meant to burn for the trivial, but to illuminate the path to your true self. When the old joys fall silent and the hobbies that once animated your days no longer speak to you, it is easy to feel as though you have been abandoned by life itself. Yet Carl Jung would tell us that this apparent emptiness is not the end of joy, but the beginning of a new relationship with the self. Awakening is never simply about losing. It is about making space for the authentic to emerge. The challenge lies in navigating that unsettling space between the loss of the old and the birth of the new. To embrace the new self requires courage, patience, and a willingness to step into the unknown without clinging to the masks that once gave you comfort. When hobbies lose their appeal, many experience what Jung described as the confrontation with the self. The ego, accustomed to being in control, feels stripped of its anchors. If I am not the one who writes, the one who plays, the one who collects, then who am I? Jung saw this as a necessary crisis because only when the ego's attachments dissolve can the larger self emerge as the true center of life. This is not annihilation, but expansion, not the death of identity, but the birth of a deeper identity that transcends surface roles. The task is to allow this expansion rather than resist it. The period after awakening often feels like wandering in a desert. The familiar oases of pleasure have dried up, and the new springs of joy have not yet appeared. In this desert, the temptation is to turn back, to try to resurrect the old hobbies and force them to provide satisfaction again. But Jung would say that the desert is part of the journey. It strips you of false nourishment so that you can learn to drink from deeper wells. The emptiness is not punishment. It is preparation. To embrace the new self, you must first endure the silence that clears the ground for new growth. This silence is fertile if you learn to listen. Jung encouraged his patients to pay attention to dreams, to fantasies, to symbols that arise in the imagination. These are the whispers of the self guiding you through the emptiness. While hobbies no longer excite the ego, the unconscious is often offering new forms of creativity and expression. The person who no longer enjoys casual painting may dream of intricate symbols. The person who loses interest in reading novels may find themselves drawn to writing reflections on their inner life. The person who abandons sports may suddenly feel called to practices that unite body and spirit, like yoga or meditation. The new self does not abandon creativity, but redirects it. To embrace this redirection is to step into the life that the self is calling you toward. The process also requires humility. The ego resists emptiness because it thrives on certainty and control. When hobbies disappear, the ego feels powerless. But Jung taught that individuation requires surrender. The new self cannot be forced into being by willpower. It emerges when the ego yields to the wisdom of the unconscious. This surrender is not passive resignation, but active openness. It is the willingness to follow synchronicities, to explore inner symbols, to trust that the psyche is guiding you even when you do not know the destination. Humility opens the door for the new self to step forward. Another important part of embracing the new self is releasing the guilt that often accompanies the loss of old joys. Many people feel ashamed when they no longer enjoy activities they once loved. They worry that something is wrong with them, that they are broken or lazy. Jung would remind us that this guilt comes from the ego's fear of change, not from the soul. There is nothing wrong in losing interest in old hobbies. It is a sign that you are evolving. The very fact that the old no longer satisfies means that the soul is demanding something greater. Instead of feeling guilty, one must recognize this as a sacred invitation. Relationships can also be challenged during this time. Friends and family who knew you through your hobbies may not understand why you no longer participate. They may see your withdrawal as detachment or decline. But Jung emphasized that individuation often involves a period of separation, where the individual must walk alone to discover their authentic self. This does not mean rejecting others permanently, but stepping away long enough to listen to the self without interference. When you embrace the new self, you may return to relationships with greater authenticity offering not the persona shaped by hobbies, but the wholeness of your true being. Embracing the new self also involves courage to explore unfamiliar paths. The psyche rarely leaves a void without eventually offering new directions. But these new paths may feel uncomfortable because they challenge your old identity. Someone who once found joy in external adventures may now feel called to inner exploration. Someone who once lived for competition may now be drawn to collaboration. Someone who once loved consuming art may now feel compelled to create it. These shifts can feel disorienting because they do not align with the persona you once projected. Yet they are the expressions of the self, calling you to live more authentically. Courage means trusting these new impulses, even when they seem unfamiliar. Jung often spoke of the role of creativity in individuation. Creativity, in its deepest sense, is not about producing works of art for approval, but about giving form to the symbols of the unconscious. When hobbies lose their appeal, it may be because they were serving the ego's need for entertainment, rather than the soul's need for expression. The new self reclaims creativity as a sacred act. The art, music, writing, or activity that emerges after awakening is infused with depth, carrying archetypal energy that speaks not only to you, but to others as well. Embracing this form of creativity means allowing the unconscious to flow through you without censoring or controlling it. This stage also brings a new relationship with meaning. Before awakening, hobbies often serve as substitutes for meaning. They give us something to do, a sense of purpose, a distraction from the void. After awakening, the soul no longer tolerates substitutes. Meaning must be authentic. This is why old activities feel lifeless. They no longer carry the weight of truth. The new self seeks activities that resonate with the deeper purpose of individuation. You may find yourself drawn to spiritual practices, service to others, study of wisdom traditions, or creative expressions that give voice to the unconscious. These are not hobbies in the ordinary sense. They are expressions of your soul's meaning. It is also important to understand that embracing the new self is not about rejecting old pleasure. Jung did not advocate asceticism or denial of joy. Rather, he encouraged a deeper form of joy that comes from alignment with the self. When the new self emerges, pleasure is not abandoned, but transformed. A walk in nature may now feel like communion with the archetype of the earth. Listening to music may awaken archetypal images. Conversations with others may become opportunities for genuine soul connection. Joy does not disappear. It becomes sacred. This transformation also reshapes time. Hobbies often fill time, preventing boredom and distraction. After awakening, time itself feels different. The new self is less interested in filling time and more interested in experiencing presence. Activities are chosen not to pass the hours, but to deepen the moment. This shift can feel disorienting in a culture obsessed with productivity and entertainment. But Jung would say that it is the sign of individuation, the movement from doing for its own sake to being in alignment with the self. Another key to embracing the new self is patience. The transition from losing old joys to finding new ones does not happen overnight. It may take months or years for the new expressions of the self to fully emerge. Jung emphasized that individuation is a lifelong process. The emptiness you feel today is only a chapter in that process, not the whole story. Patience allows you to trust that what is meant for you will arise in its time. The self cannot be rushed. It unfolds according to its own rhythm. Finally, embracing the new self requires faith in the wisdom of the psyche. Jung believed that the unconscious is not chaotic but purposeful. When it withdraws energy from hobbies, it is not abandoning you but guiding you. It is saying, this is no longer who you are. Let go, and you will discover what you are meant to become. Faith in this process allows you to move through emptiness without despair, to face uncertainty without fear, and to embrace the new self without resistance. So when you find yourself uninterested in the activities that once brought you joy, do not see it as the end of your vitality. See it as the threshold of your authenticity. You are not broken. You are being transformed. The old joys served their purpose, but the new self demands more. Embrace the silence, the emptiness, the uncertainty, for these are the conditions in which the self is born. Jung would remind you that the hobbies may return in a new form, or they may be replaced by deeper expressions of your soul. Either way, the path forward is not about clinging to the past, but about opening to the life that is waiting to emerge from within you.